So please welcome Jill today. Hi, I'm not a clinician, I'm an engineer. And so the title of our talk is Medicine Meets Engineering. And we do this to better understand pediatric injury biomechanics. Because the clinicians, oh yeah. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Okay. Clinicians best understand the injury incidence. We want to understand how it's occurring and what is happening during the impact of giving us this injury. So the leading cause of death for young people are injury. And 63% of all pediatric deaths are attributed to injury, with the most common cause being unintentional injuries. Here at the Wake Forest University Center for Injury Biomechanics, we team with Virginia Tech to understand injuries, injury mechanisms, and prevent injury. We've got a team of engineers at Wake Forest and a team of engineers at Virginia Tech, and we collaborate to better understand injuries. We do this with 3 different approaches. First, we have experimental testing, and in this case, I'll present today some of our research in football looking at helmets. Computational modeling. We have models in the computer which are essentially crash test dummies in the computer, and we can measure strains and pressures that are indicative of injury. We also have a case analysis of sirens, FARs, and NAS where we have medical imaging that we can use to understand injury. So with the experimental testing, computational modeling, and case analysis, this is what makes up the Center for Injury Biomechanics. One of the injuries that we're interested in is brain injuries in football. There's currently 1.6 to 3.8 million sports-related concussions each year in the United States, with the highest incidence in collegiate sports. We see the highest number of concussions in football. So this is a group of people that's at a high risk for concussion. So we can use them to study the incidence of concussions using their equipment, their helmets. And since they're already out there playing, it's a natural and ethically sound manner of collecting data on concussions for human volunteers. These injuries are acceleration-based injuries. They're caused by inertial loading that can either be caused from direct head loading or whole body loading, like in a motor vehicle crash. And we think of this as the brain moving relative to the skull. Acceleration is a metric that we use to characterize injury, and skull acceleration is indicative of the inertial response of brain to impact loading. It's important to note that the acceleration isn't what causes the injury, but it's the pressures and strains that we see inside the brain that are causing the injury. So here at Wake Forest, we have a group of principal investigators. This includes Dr. Joel Stitzel in biomechanics, Dr. Alex Powers, who just talked, in neurosurgery. We team with neuroradiology with Dr. Joe Malgin and Dr. Chris Whitlow, and neurology with Dr. Dwayne Godwin, and sports medicine with Dr. Daryl Rosenbaum. We also have a team of graduate students with 2 focuses on the biomechanics side and on the imaging side, and we've got a few of them here with us. We are lucky enough to have a certified athletic trainer at our high school that we're collecting data for at Reagan High School, and we have a small team of undergrads that help us collect data. So the motivation for studying concussions, specifically youth concussions, is really summed up right here. Right now, the focus is on pro and college. But if you look at the numbers, there's only 2,000 professional players, 100,000 collegiate players. But if you look at high school, there's 1.3 million players who play high school football and 3.5 million players who play youth league football. So we're going to see a lot more concussions in this population. We measure how hard they're hitting using the head impact telemetry system. In the helmet, there is a natural gap between the padding, and this sensor we can put right into the padding, and it sits flush with the padding that's already in the helmet. And during all the games and practices, each hit is wirelessly transmitted to the sideline system. It's called the sideline response system. So an impact occurs, a couple seconds later, we get that impact in our computer. So we collect these all during the season to generate the overall exposure for all of these players. This here demonstrates the helmet. This is a CT scan of the helmet. Hopefully my brain will rotate. But you can see the sensor sits right on top of the skull. And you can see where the brain is with respect to the helmet. Actually, it looks pretty small, but it's interesting to see what it would look like inside the helmet. These accelerometers, or the sensors, are spring-mounted. And that's important so that the sensor remains in contact with the head during impact, so that we can measure head acceleration and not helmet acceleration. So there's a difference. This is what we get in the computer. It's a series of vectors that show us each impact for a player. And each of these single impacts gives us an impact location and also a magnitude. We collect head acceleration data at every game and practice, and with our collaboration with Virginia Tech, we span youth, high school, and college football between the ages of 6 and 23. And you can see, here's just an example of each player instrumented on the field, and we've got an antenna that comes with our sideline response system that collects all of the hits. This is an example of an MTBI event. If you watch this player at the bottom of the screen, right here, the play is going to start. He's going to catch the ball, run down, and he gets hit, and he's down on the ground. He was wearing a sensor. He was diagnosed, clinically diagnosed with a grade 2 concussion. Our HIT system measured a peak acceleration of 200 Gs and a HIC, which is head injury criterion. It's a measure that we use in the automotive industry to measure the risk of injury, was 859. So we've collected, over the years, data for adults. And Dr. Powers showed this slide earlier. And we've collected 1.5 million head impacts for football, over 100 concussive impacts. And this has led to improved injury criterion, improved modeling of injury, and helmet safety evaluation. But we don't have any injury for children. And as you know, children are not small adults. They're special. So we need child-specific injury criteria, child-specific dummy for crash tests, and also child-specific models that we use in injury biomechanics. As Dr. Powers was telling you, Virginia Tech collected data for their first season in fall 2011 of the first pediatric exposure in football. They looked at the Auburn Mites, and these kids were the ages of 6 to 8 years old. They collected 498 impacts over the span of 6 weeks. And we see accelerations that are a little bit smaller than what we see in college and NFL. And we see a good amount of impacts occurring less than 20 Gs, which is kind of the average impact that you see. But we do see some of these higher impacts that are maybe higher risk or could be a potential for concussion. Here at Wake Forest, we are looking at junior Pee-wee and Pee-wee. Our junior Pee-wee team are the Southport Panthers. They range the ages of 9 to 11. We have 22 players on this team in our study with an average age of 10 and a half. Our Pee-wee team is the ages 10 to 12. There are 21 players part of our study on this team, and their average age is about 12. We're also looking at Reagan High School. We've got 40 players a part of our study with an average age of about 17. So far this season, since August 3rd, we still have a few more weeks left in the season, but this is, as of today, for junior Pee-wee, we have 19 instrumented players. We've collected 5,063 impacts this season. Our peak acceleration is 117 Gs with an average acceleration of about 25. If we look at the next age group, a little bit older, we've collected 4,078 impacts this season. We do have a little less instrumented, 17 players. with a max acceleration of 144 Gs and an average acceleration of 25.8 Gs. Our Reagan High School football team, we have 40 players instrumented. We've collected 13,000 impacts this season with a max acceleration of 210 Gs and an average of 27.5. So you see, as we increase in age from junior Pee Wee to high school, the averages and the max accelerations that we see are increasing also. Exposure. Our high school kids, we see about 10 hits per practice and 18 hits per game. The Pee Wee team, we see about 13.5 hits per practice and 9 hits per game. Junior Pee Wee is about 11 hits per practice and 12 hits per game. And a lot of this is dependent on the game. If they're playing a rival, you might see more hits. If they're up by 30 points, you might see a little bit less hits because they aren't playing as hard. But as we look over the season, this is cumulative by player, the number of hits per player for the season. The peak number of hits for one player is 858 on high school, 447 for Pee Wee, and 314 for junior Pee Wee. If we look at impact location for these three teams, the most frequent impact location is the face mask, followed by the back of the head and the forehead. This is a single subject for the total season if we look at all of their impacts combined. It's kind of interesting looking back at the data and seeing the different player positions because you'll see patterns for different player positions. And so this is the lineman who gets hit in the front of his helmet very frequently. So this is what we see for a whole season for one player. So what we get from the HIT system is acceleration versus time data, how their head is moving during time. And this here is an example of a crash test dummy moving at the same time as our model in the computer. So we measure our pressures and strains within the brain to predict injury. We've done previous research looking at some of the metrics that we see from our models within the computer. And CSTM is cumulative strain damage measure, and that's looking at what percentage of the brain is exceeding a certain threshold. And if you think about the boxer hit, where they're rotating, they get hit inside the head, they're rotating about their Z-axis, which is through the crown of their head. That's where we see the highest level of this injury metric, or the highest risk of injury. So for this season, we've recruited 43 players for the Youth League, 40 high school players, and we've had a very enthusiastic parent and player response. It's very important in conducting a study where you're involved with the parents is that the parents are very enthusiastic. We've performed baseline MRI and MEG, and we're currently collecting HITS practice data, HITS data at every practice and game for all of our players in our studies. We perform a youth impact cognitive test. There's a specific cognitive test for ages 12 and a half and younger, and those players that are older than 12 and a half receive the adult impact. We also take a resting state functional MRI and MEG, and so far this season we've had 2 high school concussions and 1 Pee Wee concussion. Like I said, at the very beginning of the season we do a preseason MRI and MEG. In the event of a concussion, they get an MRI and a MEG and another cognitive test. And during the MRI and the MEG, we place fiducials or markers at the ears and the eyes so that we can align the MRI and the MEG to the same space. And the Answer Lab, which is our neuroradiology lab, has developed a fully automated MEG processing pipeline so that we can understand what we see post-concussion and preseason and any differences that we're seeing between the two. Once the season ends, we'll collect a post-season cognitive test, post-season MRI, and a post-season MEG. So the ultimate goal of this study is to take what we see at practices and games to understand the biomechanics, collect structural and functional imaging as well as MEG, and perform cognitive and behavioral testing in the hopes that we can better understand concussions. Our goal isn't to diagnose concussions, but to understand the exposure and what we see from imaging or cognitive testing or from some of the acceleration data that we get. Our colleagues at Virginia Tech have developed football helmet evaluations, and they've presented helmet ratings, which combines impact exposure with risk analysis to assess helmet performance for consumers. So it's like when you get a vehicle, a 5-star rating for your car versus a 3-star rating. We have this for helmets. And there's some math that goes beyond this, which I won't go into. Get your papers and pencils. But it's the STAR rating system, and it stands for Summations of Tests for the Analysis of Risk. And what this does is it looks at the exposure, who's getting concussions and who's not. It's looking at the risk that we've developed to look at the incidence for each helmet. What percentage or what probability would their risk of concussion be with a certain helmet? And that's what ultimately gives us our STAR rating system. And this gives us a rating from 5 stars down to not recommended helmets. And this is really given manufacturers a reason to design safer helmets. There is a reduction in the risk of injury with a safer helmet. So this is really important going forward in keeping our kids safe on the football field. So there's 3 strategies that we can do in the incidence of minimizing concussion, and that includes rule changes such as the kickoff rule, proper technique, hitting techniques, teaching kids the proper hitting techniques, and better equipment such as helmets. So if we can reduce the exposure, to head impact and reduce the concussion risk, we can have fewer concussions. So we get the question all the time, do helmets really work? And the question is yes, they do. We've shown scientifically that there are a reduced risk of concussion. The helmets absorb energy during the impact, and they reduce the accelerations that we see to ultimately reduce the risk of concussion. So taking a step away from the football, some of the injuries that we see in football, and looking at some of the more severe injuries, here in the Center for Injury Biomechanics, we work with the Crash Injury Research Engineering Network, which is a collection of 6 universities throughout the United States that looks at traumatic injuries that come to a level 1 trauma center. It's the only database that has detailed data leading up to the crash, post-crash measurements of the vehicle, how fast they were going, as well as medical imaging. And the goal is to bring together medical and engineering knowledge about real-world crashes to improve our understanding of injury and ultimately save lives. One of the focuses of our research is on pediatric occupants in motor vehicle crashes. Many of you may know that motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of death for children between the ages of 3 and 14 years old. And child safety seats have been shown to reduce the risk of fatal pediatric injuries by 71% for infants and 54% for toddlers in passenger cars. Here at Wake Forest, we have our study team that gets together and analyzes these injuries, and this includes a study coordinator that goes and collects these patients for our study, a crash scene investigator who goes to the crash scene as well as to the vehicle and measures measurements and takes photos within the vehicle of contact points. We have engineering and imaging support, and we work with doctors at Baptist from trauma surgeons, radiologists, pediatric surgeons, orthopedic surgeons. We have a radiologist and a trauma nurse that work with us as well. We assess the severity of injury using the abbreviated injury scale. This ranges from an AIS-1 to an AIS-6, where an AIS-1 is a scrape or scratch. A lot of the injuries that we see are AIS-3 and 4, which are serious and severe injuries. This includes brain injuries. And the most severe, which we don't see very often, are AIS-6, and those are the untreatable injuries that ultimately lead to death. So the cornerstone of Siren is the case review. This is when everybody comes together and they analyze the case. Our cases are enrolled based on the injury severity, and they have to have at least an AIS-3 injury. We review 3 to 5 cases per session per month, and we do about 40 cases per year. Like I said before, we have medical personnel from trauma, radiology, orthopedics, pediatrics, and EMS, as well as engineering personnel and our crash scene investigator that come together and look at the injuries, the vehicle, and the radiology to really understand how these injuries are happening. We have a special focus on pregnant and pediatric occupants. So during the case review, we want to know what's the injury causation, and that's where the biomechanics comes in. We want to know what is the biomechanics of the injury, and that comes to us at 3 levels of the crash, the regional mechanism outside the body, and the organ level mechanism, what's happening to that organ. So this gives us something that we can work with, a biomechanics paradigm, where we can go from outside the vehicle, looking at the crash reconstruction and the crash severity, to inside of the vehicle. What was contacted? Was there belt use? Did the airbag deploy? We can then go outside the occupant. We're stepping from outside the vehicle to inside the person. So if we look outside the occupant, we see soft tissue contusions. Where did they hit their head? And we know approximately what their kinematics in the vehicle are. We also know information about the person, their level of consciousness, and where that injury is inside of them from the medical imaging. So our biomechanics paradigm is going from outside of the vehicle to inside the person. One thing that we're looking at is brain injury in motor vehicle crashes. And so far we've collected 272 CT scans that show us intracranial injury from the Siren database. And this shows the distribution of these brain injuries, with the most frequent being subarachnoid hemorrhage and subdural hematoma. We can take the medical imaging and we can identify them slice by slice. We just color slice by slice the collective volume of injury. And we do this for each individual injury. And we segment them using semi-automated methods within the computer. We also identify the point of contact from the soft tissue scalp contusion. And not everybody has a soft tissue scalp contusion, but there are components in the vehicle where we have an idea of what they contacted, so we approximate the contact location from the kinematics of the occupant. We also identify the injury location. This here, the color, is not actually the image, but it's what we color over to identify that injury. So the blue here is the subdural hematoma, and the green is the subarachnoid hemorrhage. So we've done a subdural hematoma analysis. That was our first injury that we looked at. And we looked at near side and frontal collisions. And we found in near side collisions, the subdural hematoma volume was actually correlated with the crash velocity. So as the crash was more severe, we actually saw more blood. We also saw a trending correlation between age and midline shift. Looking at frontal collisions, midline shift was positively correlated with maximum crush in the vehicle. So when we saw more crush, we saw more midline shift. So that's another indicator of a more severe brain injury. And something that we would expect to see is that the age was correlated with the actual volume of subdural hematoma. So I wanted to walk you through a head injury example for one of our pediatric occupants. This is an 8-month-old male right rear occupant. He was incorrectly placed within the vehicle for his age. His car seat was forward-facing. The safety seat latch was incorrectly installed. This was a moderate frontal impact in a small passenger vehicle. The child struck the rear seat back and then was loaded by the car seat. So what we get in our Siren case review is a crash scene reconstruction, where we look at the oncoming vehicle and the struck vehicle to see how these cars are moving during the impact. This is some of the information that we get from our crash scene investigator. I was talking about the measurements. This is an example of the measurements. And pictures within the vehicle of how the car seat was situated, as well as contacts within the vehicle. In this specific case, this was a frontal collision at 24 miles per hour. We also have medical imaging data, which is what's so unique about Siren. We see images of our patient in medical imaging, and we see that they had a skull fracture, a subdural hematoma, a subarachnoid hemorrhage, and they spent 4 days in the ICU with ventilation. In our case review, we determined that the cause of the injury was contact with the driver's seat. This here is just a video of the skull fracture and how we can use some of the technology that we have within the hospital to identify the injury location in order to better understand the biomechanics. Where is that injury occurring? So this is just an example of that child's skull fracture. So I can click out of this. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has 2 recommendations. First, they recommend that children older than 13 should not be allowed in the front seat. I think that's something that people have known about for a while now. And children under the height of 4 foot 9 inches should have some type of child safety seat. Looking at the Siren database, we find out of 607 cases, 104 of these included pediatric cases where the child was under 13, but they were sitting in the front seat. We also found 227 cases where there was a child who was under the height of 4 feet 9 inches, and they were not in a child safety seat. This is all important information for letting people know the importance of properly sitting within the vehicle and how you can prevent injuries. In comparison to the case that I showed you, the occupant was under 4 foot 9 inches, and they were seated in child safety seats, but they were improperly seated in their child safety seats. We looked at child injuries by body region and by crash type. And in this graph here, frontal collisions are in blue and side collisions are in red. And we see the highest incidence of head injuries for side collisions. And we can look at face injuries, but that's included into head injuries. We see a lot of these head impacts in near and frontal collisions for children. We look at head injury severity by restraint and frontal impacts, where the green line is a child safety seat with seatbelt, and the green line is a red seatbelt only. We see an increase in head injury occurrence and severity for improper restraints in the vehicle. Spine injuries is another important one. This again, green is the child safety seat with seatbelt, and red is seatbelt only. We see an increase in spinal injury occurrence as well as severity for improper restraint. So in conclusion, we looked at pediatric occupants in moderate severity crashes, and they're mostly in passenger cars. We see that over half of the crashes are in frontal collisions. And we see that National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has regulations, but a lot of the injuries that we see are from occupants that were improperly restrained. And we also see different injury distributions for frontal and side impacts. So future work that injury biomechanics is looking at is creating pediatric anthropomorphic test device, or crash test dummies, what most people call them, for particular body regions. And this is an example of the current crash test dummy that's used, and it's basically a person shrink down to something smaller. So we want to make this more anthropomorphically correct. We've had continued participation in outreach events to promote child safety restraints, and we also want to research specific restraint types and how this can reduce injuries. One of the more recent studies that we're working on is the Pediatric Advanced Automatic Crash Notification, or AACN. Many vehicles now have OnStar. Companies are looking into creating algorithms for automatic crash notification. So to target pediatric injuries, we want to look at age, height, weight, and maturity thresholds for pediatric specific injuries. We have a list of the most frequent pediatric injuries for each threshold from the NASPDS, which is the National Automotive Safety Sampling. We want to target these injuries as either being severe, time-sensitive, or predictable. And the goal of the automatic crash notification is to get the patient to the right place with the right treatment at the right time. And that's what gives us a successful algorithm. So with everything I presented today, I just wanted to thank the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, our Siren Partner Centers, our Southport Panthers and Reagan High School football, and everybody who's helped out. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you have any questions. Yeah.
The North Carolina law for restraining children, and what is their criteria?
Oh, I'm actually not sure what the North Carolina law is.
My 10-year-old will tell you.
Really?
That it's 80 pounds to be in the front seat.
Huh?
And
Okay, so it's state specific. Okay. Yeah.
They have to use them for 3 seasons. Is that helmet still probably a 5-star? Because they can't afford your helmet. The second question is, how do you choose which 40 patients to evaluate in a year's time?
Okay. For your first question, I'll repeat the question. The first question was, these kids have their helmets in high school that they use for multiple seasons. Has the integrity the same after 3 seasons, or is it decreased? And nobody's actually looked at that. When we test the quality of helmets, or Virginia Tech, if you test them, they test new helmets. And so that's actually a really interesting thing that we could do is after we've collected the Virginia Tech helmets, for example, we've been doing that for over 10 years, we could assess the integrity of them. And your second question is, how do we pick which 40 cases we assess each year? And that's based on recruitment. I'm a little less familiar with the recruitment for Siren because I work more on the football side of this, but we take what we can get. If we can get as many patients as we can, it's really getting what we can get for that month. And it comes out to be about 40 patients for the year. Yeah.
For your studies, the ones that you study, like the pre-season, NED and all that stuff, do all players get the postseason as well, or just the ones that have the concussion?
Every player will get a postseason MRI, MEG, and cognitive test.
Okay, and so that would be able to find like just concussions that weren't necessarily diagnosed? Or...
No, we're actually looking more at repeat impacts. So these kids have had a lot of impacts. We want to know something happening with their brain. We won't be able to tell if they've had a concussion, though. Yeah.
So, in children you studied who were helmeted and instrumented and had clinical concussion, I'm curious to know, were those forces predictive of that concussion? Were they greater forces? Was there a particular area of the brain that was impacted? Do you have any information on that?
What we've looked at so far for this season is just the acceleration data, and the threshold that's out there is having a higher risk for concussion is 98 Gs, but our impact so far has been less than that. Yeah, but we've also had impacts that are greater than 98 Gs that aren't concussions that are presented to us. So each person is different, and so their threshold for what forces they can take is specific to them. And as far as where within the brain, we're actually working through that with the imaging and MEG right now. Yes?
I want to ask about soccer. I know your football and football helmets. They have no protection at all.
Yeah.
And I noticed it was boys were number 2 coming down from football. Boys soccer was the next time. Are there studies? I mean, they're so unprotected.
Yeah, and one thing that they have implemented is no heading under the age of 14. We actually have a collegiate soccer player on our study right now who might have some impact or might have some thoughts on this, but I don't think that they could helmet them in soccer. The only thing that they can do is reduce the heading incidence. If you get a concussion. For soccer. What she was saying is if you have a concussion, they make you wear a headband for heading, which is, I guess, supposed to absorb the energy from the impact. No. Yes.
Do you have any studies on rugby players?
No, but they are very high incidence, and those are some pretty severe injuries. But it would be interesting to look at. I know the big thing that we just went to a concussion conference last week, and the big thing they were talking about was helmeting lacrosse players from getting hit in the head with a stick. Yeah.
I had heard something about there possibly being a new rule or something. If you have 3 concussions in a season or something, are you out for that season or are you out for life?
What we have learned, I guess, from our research is that not each concussion is equal. So you can't say that you get 3 concussions that they're all equal and so that means you're done. You have to treat it on a case-by-case basis. So if you have 1 concussion that's really bad and you have symptoms for months and months and months, then maybe you should think about not playing anymore. But I think the way things are going now are clinicians don't want players to stop playing football because it's important, especially in high school, for your social development and getting out there. But so from what we've talked to some of the researchers, they don't want to pull them from football, but they want to look at it on a case-by-case basis. Yeah.
Are there any plans to do more longitudinal studies where you take the players that have had a concussion and then not just do a postseason MRI, but do it every 6 months, every year to see the progression?
It's not part of our study right now, but we've been talking about it. It would be really interesting to see what their MEG especially would look like 6 months from now in January. But maybe for next season. Thanks for your questions.